Hello, and welcome to Right to Be Wrong, the show that revives the art of conversation, accommodating varied views on sports, culture, politics, world events, and every topic under the sun. After all, you have a right to be wrong. Here are your hosts, Dave and Tony.
That time of the week again, Tone, you are going to absolutely lose 2 hours of your life. I'm going to steal it. You're never going to get back. We're back in studio after having last week off. And guess what? I decided we needed someone smarter than me. Hard to believe. But we're actually going to have a guest. How have you been, Tone?
I've been good. Back in the swing at work. Life of the bean counter continues.
Boring.
Yeah.
This is why we need guests.
That's right.
I've got a boring co-host.
I'm just glad, Dave, if there's ever any doubt that you were the dumbest person in the room, that is well and truly reinforced tonight.
Well, it's going to be reinforced because I tell you who we've got. We have one of my former professors from WSU or UWS, as it was when we were there, Dr. Peter Mauch, who is a Japanese historian, specific interest in the Imperial Japanese Army, Imperial Japanese Navy. And he's written a few books with a recent edition coming out soon on, I say Tojo, but I know that's the mispronounced way, and we shall get it right from the expert himself. I highly recommend to students, anyone that's actually enrolled at WSU and wants to do things, any of his classes, I highly recommend, particularly war if he's still running it. And one interesting thing I know you don't know, Tony.
Yes, mate.
There are two positives here. One is Dr. Peter Mauch and Novak Djokovic. Between the two of them have 24 Grand Slam titles, but he is a Queenslander, don't hold it against him. Welcome, Dr. Peter Mauch, to the Right to Be Wrong podcast.
Hello, gents. How are you both?
Very well.
Looking forward to a good chat.
Thanks.
I already feel like there's more intelligence on the other side just looking at how he's dressed compared to us. It's going to be a good night. What are we going to go over tonight, Tone?
We are talking, I think the focus is going to be around World War II. And for me, I said this before we went on air, it's just education. And one of the things I regret, one of the many things I regret about my schooling, was I went down a path of, economics, maths, bit of science. And I've ever since that, I've regretted not knowing enough about history. So now I'll come across a topic and I'll go, let's do a bit of research, and I'll find something out about it. And I feel completely ignorant that I never knew that until I was 54. Right.
Well, the thing, speaking of that, why I reached out to Dr. Mauch is the fact that I keep coming across so many Australians that have no idea, A, how our alliance with the US came to be, B, why freedom of speech matters, why we don't speak Japanese, essentially why Australia is the great place it is, and extrapolating that across the world, the same principles of fighting the Nazis. But what we're going to do is we're going to get an expert in the field that's actually not going to talk dribble like we do, and he's going to lay out how the Second World War came to be in terms of the Pacific Theatre, the interconnectedness of Australia's relationship with the US, the end of its relationship with Great Britain. And effectively, Tone, I'm going to sit and have a ginger beer, and my word count will be through the floor. So on that note, Dr. Mauch, please introduce yourself and give our listeners and watchers your biographical background.
Sure. So as you suggest, a Queenslander through and through.
Don't hold it against him, people.
It's been a while since I've been up there, but would certainly never switch allegiance to this side of the border.
That's the end of the podcast.
I left Queensland quite a long time ago. Lived in Kyoto, Japan for...
There you go. Someone that speaks the language already showing us up.
There we are.
I'm such a bogan.
Maybe 10 years. Split my time there between two universities over there. In fact, the first I was at was Kyoto University. And in fact, I'll be back there the second half of this year. So I've got sabbatical this year and I'll be over there. Scholar in residence, I think is the official title. So I'll have a nice 6 months return back over there later this year. In terms of what I do, so as Mr. Lodge here says, I specialize in the Imperial Japanese Army, Imperial Japanese Navy. My particular interest is how, say, military doctrine or maritime or naval doctrine, how that played a role in the two armed services, the impact they had on decision making in the Japanese policy-making process and how those military doctrines, maritime doctrines, how that kind of played out in their thinking about what Japan ought to do next, and then how ultimately how that contributed to Japanese policy and, well, in this case, say, World War II.
So was this something that interested you when you were here before you went to Japan, or as you were there, you found that this interest grew as you spent time there?
So my honours supervisor up at University of Queensland, fantastic American scholar, Dr. Joe Syracusa. He's over in Perth these days. He's not a young man anymore, but
does he appear? He used to appear on Sky. Yeah.
You see him on Sky.
What's his name? Stefanovic, the other Stefanovic, would bring him on in the morning, and every time he came on, I thought he was balanced. He's obviously well versed in everything you're speaking about, but there was nothing. It was just like straight, and I learned something every time I listened to that bloke.
That's your Monday nights.
He's really something. So Joe, he got me started in this game, and in essence, if I hope I'm not misrepresenting him, but if I remember his advice, some of his advice to me correctly, basically he told me that I needed to pick. He wanted me to pick a big topic and to really chase that big topic, and the big topic within, for me at least, that meant Japanese-American relations, and you don't get much bigger than Pearl Harbor. So that was I simplify a little bit, there's my initial hook. When I moved to Kyoto, I was working under two scholars. One was Asada Sadao, who was quite literally Japan's greatest naval historian. And so he, along with my other supervisor, Nagai, the two of them essentially helped me see that within the Japanese policy-making process, first up, I mean, we use the term militaristic a lot. It gets thrown around a little bit like fascism or totalitarianism, and all of these kind of words get thrown around. I'm not sure that anyone necessarily understands those terms very much, and they started helping me see precisely what that term meant, certainly in a Japanese, the term militarism, what that meant in a Japanese context, because aside from anything else, maybe the easiest way to explain it is that, so let's do it like this. So from roughly 1906, 1907, the Japanese Navy starts its war planning processes. This is in the immediate aftermath of war against Russia. So Japan defeats Russia, 1904-05, and then in the next 18 months or so, both services, they sit down and they start planning ahead for the next war. This is what armed services do, right? So if we focus in on the Japanese Navy, quite naturally, they focus their attentions out on the Pacific Ocean, because this is where their ships are going to be fighting any future war. From there, their next point of call is to determine who that likely opponent will be. And so far as the Navy was concerned, there were two likely opponents. One was the United States, and then secondarily was Britain down in the south in Singapore, and indeed down here.
And so this is all 06, 07.
We're going way back.
Yeah, fine, it's all good.
Yep. And so essentially then what plays out over the ensuing decades is that all war planning for war against the United States is completely conducted by the Japanese Navy. It does 99.9% of war planning for that possibility. And interestingly, the US Navy is doing the same thing the other way around over the other side of the Pacific. When it's planning for a future war, it's developing a set of war plans, and these two war plans they're so neatly symmetrical. It's perfect the way that essentially they're seeing eye to eye. They agree perfectly on how this war is going to play out in the future. Not that they're talking to each other, because these are top secret plans, right? But when you look back at them now, you see these guys, they were talking the same language. They weren't talking the same language, but they were talking the same language as it was.
Just to clarify on that, when you say the plans aligned, is this in terms of everything from geographic locations that are strategic through to the advent of the aircraft carrier and air superiority and blue water navies and things like that? Or is it purely just around the resources? Yeah,
that's a really good question. But maybe more just in terms of what we might call pure strategy. So in essence, what they both imagined happening, they saw a Japanese attack on the Philippines, which would invariably bring the US in, Philippines being a US colony, so that would bring the US into the war. they both assumed that the US fleet would come steaming across the Pacific. The Japanese Navy would lie in wait over in the Western Pacific. And then, I mean, I simplify somewhat, right? So as the US comes across the Pacific, the Japanese are planning to kind of snipe away at them as they're coming across. Equally, as the fleet comes across the Pacific, it's going to suffer some wear and tear as it comes across, right? So it's going to lose a little bit of its battle strength as it comes across the Pacific. And that then, that sort of process of attrition evens up the numbers a little bit, because the US Navy was bigger, essentially, than the Japanese Navy. But this would even up the numbers. They hit the Western Pacific. The Japanese Navy is lying in wait there for them. There's going to be, according to their war plans, there's going to be a decisive, what they called a decisive battle. And then, depending who you ask, certainly in the Japanese Navy, down the decades, opinion was divided, but certainly there were officers who believed that they had at least a fighting chance in that decisive battle that would take place. And ultimately, the Pacific War was a bit more complex than that, because you had, so the US counterattack came there were two kind of arrowheads, as it were. One came from the South Pacific up through, beginning at Guadalcanal and then working its way through New Guinea, the Solomons, etc. And obviously this is where Australia came into the war. The second US counterattack, it started a little bit later, but it came directly through the Central Pacific, exactly what these two navies have been planning for a long time. Back to the point where I'm going with all this, precisely because, and again, if we focus in on the Japanese process, precisely because it's the Navy that does all of the planning for war with the United States. It's the Navy that has the voice in the policymaking process. Its voice is determining in terms of when they're trying to decide policies to take towards the United States, when they're trying to decide, let me see if I can think of an example. When they're trying to decide, okay, to put it very, very simply in really broad brushstrokes, do we take a conciliatory stance toward the United States, or do we take a far less conciliatory stance toward the United States? The Navy bears an enormous responsibility in that decision, precisely because if worst comes to worst, it does come to war with the United States, therefore it has to factor all of this has to be factored into the decisions around what stance to take toward the United States. And again, the Navy bears enormous responsibility for that. Maybe I'll just stop there.
Well, someone, a wise man at Western, actually said to me, effectively, there was internally within the branches, there was conflict, but between the Imperial Japanese Army, Imperial Japanese Navy, there's effectively a set to of, we want to control it, we're the Army, we'll do the fighting, and the Navy is, well, that's fine, you do it then and find your own way there, because we're not, and that's, in the end, the point is, without us, you're not going anywhere. Now, you said 1905, 1906. That's interesting. For all the times I've learned under you, I've learned a lot. That's a long way out from Pearl Harbor. And that predates the 1908 Great White Fleet. So then the question I have is the Great White Fleet that gets sent around the world. This is the US, it's called the Great White Fleet. It was all painted white, but they send these 8 sort of battleships around the world as a show of force. How much of that coming around the Pacific is related to them seeing back in 1905, 1906, this Japanese imperial expansionism?
So,
or does that just happen to be a correlation? It's not causation.
You're on the right track, but you haven't quite nailed it. So
this is why I'm only a master and not a PhD.
Well, so Theodore Roosevelt sends the Great White Fleet around, including down here to Australia. Ultimately, it made a visit in a couple of places in Japan, and actually the Japanese put on a real show for the Great White Fleet. It was a huge welcome, which in a way it kind of turned the tables on Teddy Roosevelt's diplomacy, because Roosevelt, I think one thing that we need to be aware of is, let's put it like this. So when I say that the Japanese Navy from, say, 1907 begins planning for war against the United States, and equally, at more or less the same time, the US Navy is doing precisely the same thing with regard to Japan, I think it's important to remain aware that, for example, the US Navy is not just planning for the possibility of war against Japan. It's also planning, for example, for the possibility of war against Britain. It's planning for the possibility of war against Germany and all the other. So, in other words, the fact that they're planning for the possibility of war doesn't mean they're champing at the bit and gearing up for a war in the Pacific. They're planning for the possibility. I liken it like, I use this kind of analogy. I'm not sure if it's a great analogy, but I use this in the classroom with students and point out that if you're a footy coach, one of the first things you do, I suspect, without actually being a footy coach, so I'm being a little bit pretentious here, but let's work with me on this one. I mean, one of the first things they do is they look at the season ahead and they say, right, so first up we play Team A, second round we play Team B, and so on and so forth. From there, the coach's job, I think, is to prepare his team as best he's able or she's able to get it in a position to knock over Team A in round 1 and Team B in round 2 and Team C, and so on and so forth, right? That's exactly what's happening in this planning process. Well, not exactly, because whereas the footy coach has a schedule that's lined up for him that says round 1, Team A, round 2, Team B, the war planner it's not quite set out quite so well and so neatly for them. Nonetheless, they can see it. I mean,
well, the interesting thing on that analogy, right, is you looking ahead at, say, round 15, right? So say you're making your plans. I think we'll win here. Hopefully you pull this off, accept a loss here and here. But that's interesting that you say not only planning for the possibility of war with Japan in Great Britain, because that's planning for a match that you wouldn't expect to have because they're allies. And at the moment, without going too far off, at the moment with the Trump and NATO and all those things, this is really showing that 100 years ago, the US was still making plans for the possibilities of wars with allies.
Well, they weren't allies at that point in time. Keep that in mind. In fact, actually, it was the Japanese and the Brits who were allies, courtesy of the Anglo-Japanese alliance, which perhaps at least partly explains why the United States is why those US naval planners are looking ahead to at least the possibility of war against Britain. But I think, to be honest, that one was more of almost a kind of an academic exercise rather than we got to get these plans right because you never know when we're going to need them. I think it was...
Yeah, and look, that's fine, but for me, I still find it interesting. Even if you went, this is plan triple Z, just in case, that wouldn't have even entered my mind, right? Like at that time, looking at alliances and the like, it wouldn't have entered. Where the Japanese is also interesting so early because this predates League of Nations, where they feel offended by not being taken seriously as a great power. This is a long way out, a lot earlier than I thought. To me, I would have thought it turned sour in the 30s when you start to see Japan's interest in the greater East Asian prosperity sphere and being the hegemon within the region, and particularly the invasion of China in 1937. That's so interesting to me that the Japanese are looking ahead so early.
I think it's important to here's maybe the easiest way to put, or the best way to put it. This planning is meant to be pure strategic planning. It's not meant to reflect the political situation. It's meant to be purely a matter of
what if.
Exactly.
It sounds like, to me, it sounds like a corporate risk management exercise, right? Like you're looking at even those low probability things that may never happen, you still have to consider them and turn your head to it. Like the fact that we could actually have a war against
you
them.
but and I could be wrong here. This is in your wheelhouse as a CFO, but to what depth would you do it, right? There might be an overarching thing.
Yeah.
But you've only got so much time, money, and resources.
That's what I mean. But then you would consider it. You say there might be a really low risk, and you say, we're happy to accept that risk because we want to walk up the scale in terms of the risk we want to actually effectively manage. That'd be the medium risk and the high rated risks, or the targets you believe are more valuable, and you'd put more time and resources into that.
Well, I'm already smarter for having Dr. Mauch on.
Can I ask? I'm interested. What was the genesis? Where did this Japanese imperialism come from? Like what? Like I know it's a big question because culturally, there must have been an aspiration to have significant influence over their region, right? And And then we go through the next 30, 40 years, and then the horrors that follow Japan. But I think the culture, it's hard to change, right? I just thought culturally, what was the genesis of this? Where did this aspiration come from to dominate that region? Was it just at the time the politicians that were in charge, or the military in Japan got a little bit ambitious and kind of looked out beyond the border and thought, where can we take this thing?
And off the back of that, you can probably then clarify militarism in terms of Japan and how it links with, going from what they are into.
Okay. So lots to try to, and pull me up at any point, right?
No, it's all good.
This is where we need a whiteboard.
Okay. Let's begin at the beginning. So we'll go with the imperialism question, I think, because I think that's probably the most logical place to start. I think it's important to keep in mind that I'm going to do the really annoying historians thing. This drives my dear bride crazy. She asks me a question and I say, well, to answer that question, we need to go further back in time. She's like, no, just answer the question.
No, see, with a wife, that's a problem.
Yes.
Here,
it works.
It's information.
Okay,
so you go for it.
Well, see, I do this to my students too, right? I just unleash on them and just say, well, you guys have to live with it. Whereas she doesn't necessarily have to. But anyway. So we'll go back a little bit in time and note that between, again, I'll paint in reasonably broad brushstrokes, but essentially from, say 1603 all the way through until 1868, Japan closes itself off from almost all contact with the Western world, and it has its reasons for doing this. We won't. Maybe that need not detain us.
Specific episode on that.
Yeah. That one. That's another conversation, perhaps. But they do close themselves off from all contact with the Western world. By the 1850s, that was no longer possible, and in essence, the Western world imposes itself on the Japanese.
Isn't this Commander Matthew Perry and his gunboat diplomacy?
Bingo. So he starts.
I did listen to you.
There you go. You go. He's a good student. So the US first, but the other powers were, the Russians were in amongst it. The British were there as well. The French were there as well. So the Western powers are moving around in the Far East, and what they called the Far East at least. And let's remember that they're colonizing the region in its virtual entirety, so that we have what today we call Indonesia became the Dutch East Indies, of course, Vietnam, Laos, etc., French Indochina. The Brits are everywhere. They're in Burma. I don't like the word Myanmar. I go with Burma.
But we do like a tangent, or as Donald would call it, it's a weave. I do like the old names. I prefer Ceylon, Burma, Persia, Rhodesia. But anyway, I digress.
Yes, I prefer Burma. We'll leave it there. I prefer Burma to Myanmar. But the Brits are certainly there. They're in Singapore. They're in Malaya, what they called Malaya at the time, and Hong Kong, of course. And then China is being what I think most people would consider at least kind of semi-colonized, where the Western powers are kind of carving it up. In fact, they referred to it as such. They referred to it as slicing up the Chinese melon. So they're taking chunks, usually off the coast. They're not so interested in the interior. And so Japan is introduced into this Western conceived and Western dominated world. And they look around and they see their neighborhood has been completely dominated by the West. Now the West is pointing its guns at them and saying, you guys have got to play. And if you don't, then, you suffer the consequences. And so the Japanese responded with alacrity to this, and they, again, I'm speaking in really broad brushstrokes, but in essence, they launched themselves on a determined, essentially a game of catch-up with the West. And this involved change at just the most astonishing scale, but maybe we can say it involved, or it ramped up modernization to a point that certainly until that point, modernization was happening in Japan. From 1868, it goes into overdrive. And
It's the first Asian country to industrialize. Someone else taught me that.
100%.
That's
And
two things I listened to you.
they certainly did. They
Once we
certainly
get
did.
the three, I don't need to say more.
Then, well, I think where I'm going with this, they're introduced into a world where, and in fact, there's the conversations within Japan at the time are saying, they're saying to themselves, "This is a dog eat dog world," and they very quickly came to the realization that if they were going to catch up, or if they weren't going to catch up to the West, that they would be colonized or semi-colonized at best, or at best. If they were to avoid that fate, I mean, as they saw it, there was really only one way to avoid that fate, and it was to play the game. So they launched their own imperialist exercise, and it begins in the 1800s. So there's depends who you ask, but the Japanese fought a war against China in 1894-95, and they won that very, very convincingly. Among other things, that meant Taiwan became a Japanese colony. So straight up, that's it's other. We could quibble over whether that's the starting point of the Japanese Empire, and there are other possible starting points, but I think it's pretty good. It's a good place for us to start with. Korea becomes a Japanese colony, and that one, it's a bit more gradual. The Japanese had, in fact, the war against China had been a war over the fate of Korea. The Japanese pushed the Chinese out of Korea, and they thought, great, now Korea will at least fall under our sphere of influence. Well, depending who you ask, if you ask the Japanese, unfortunately, the Russians took the Chinese place. War against Russia in 1904-05, we talked about that already. The Japanese smashed the Russians on every front. That wipes out all competition in Korea, and by 1910, Korea is, for all intents and purposes, it's a Japanese colony. So in other words, the Japanese Empire, it has quite deep roots, much earlier roots than what was taking place in the 1930s. Yeah. And I'll round it off with a thought. Certainly, at least up until the 1930s, the Japanese Empire conceived of itself within a wider structure of where you've got the British Empire, you've got the French Empire, you've got the American Empire, the Dutch Empire, and they saw themselves as one empire among many in the region. The key point of difference by the 1930s, certainly, it was popular within the Japanese army, and it became increasingly so through the 1930s. There was a sense that that the Japanese Empire should dominate the region and effectively, ultimately the idea was expel the West.
Okay. That's really interesting. So today, as I normally do with prep for the podcast, I'll throw in some random questions into the internet Google machine, sort of spits out at me. And I asked, just give me a pre-war escalation timeline, like World War II. Let me know a bit of history there. And this is where I learnt my first fact of the day, that in 1931, Japan invades Manchuria, established, how do you pronounce it? Manchukuo. Mm-hmm. Often regarded by historians as the true beginning of World War II in Asia.
Yeah.
Does this historian agree?
That's why.
It's a definite stepping stone along the way.
Yeah.
There's no doubt.
Was that part of that agenda to kind of dominate as opposed to just be one of...
No, certainly not dominate. So earlier I was talking about how a Japanese naval officer, how he thought, what he looked. Essentially, he just set his gaze out across the Pacific, and his time and his efforts were totally taken by what was happening out in the Pacific. But if you're a Japanese army officer, the Pacific has zero interest.
That's right.
So in fact, what you see, it's a perfectly bifurcated or a completely divided Japanese army and navy, because an army officer, rather than looking out to the Pacific, instead would look over to the Eurasian continent.
Yeah.
And in particular, early in the piece, they saw Korea. This was there for the Japanese army to defend. And it's not necessarily easy. And so they engage in their own processes of war planning. And so for them, whereas for the Navy, it's US number one and Britain secondary, for the Japanese army, it's Russia or later the Soviet Union number one. China is the second kind of possibility. Manchuria that's China's northeastern provinces, so sort of attached, if you sort of draw a map in your mind of sort of the top of Korea and then extending over towards the west of China, towards the west, I guess. And it's bordering sort of Siberia and all of those sorts of areas. This is a wild story, right? Because the Japanese army, certainly through the late 1920s, was convinced that more forthright action was necessary in China than had previously taken place. A lot of army officers convinced themselves that more forthright action was necessary. They ran into a bit of a stumbling block, as it were, because the government itself just refused to entertain this. And so
some of the officers just take action and do things themselves and force that.
So bingo. So
that's three now.
There you go. There's 3 out of 3. So the Japanese army maintained what was known as the Kwantung Army, and it was over there in Manchuria, and it was essentially protecting the rights and interests which Japan had won from Russia at the end of the Russo-Japanese War back in 1904-05. And it was certainly by the 1930s, it was a crack force. This was a really, really serious garrison force over on the continent. It had its own command structures. It had these guys were really, really and of course movement freely. If you could be an officer who spent much of his time in Japan, but then would be sent over for a time with
this
the Kwantung
where
Army.
Tojo cuts his teeth?
He certainly did. By the mid-1930s, he spent a couple of years over there in the Kwantung Army, and the Kwantung Army was known. It built a reputation, and now we're getting to the question to the Manchurian incident. It built a reputation for what they called gekokujo, which is, you can translate it in...
Say that 3 times when you're drunk, Tone.
Yeah.
You can translate it a bunch of different ways, but the easiest way to translate it is to say it's insubordination. So in essence, the Kwantung Army, it almost kind of prided itself on arriving at a strategic outlook entirely independent of whatever the military authorities in Tokyo or indeed the Japanese government was doing. And so, long story short, September 31, a couple of officers in the Kwantung Army decided that it was time. And so they bombed, some of the railway track just in Manchuria. They used that. They blamed the Chinese for it, used it as a cause for war. And they then, it was a warlord army up in Manchuria, and they chased those guys. And they ultimately, or in a fairly short space of time, they established this supposedly independent state, a puppet state, Manchukuo.
And isn't this where they get Puyi, the last
emperor
of China, to be the puppet
Correct.
leader?
Correct.
Now, just on that too, when we're talking about the militarization of Japan, how much of the samurai code and the samurai history played a role in modern Japan as we speak, from say 1900 and 1940? How much of that is attributable to that background of the samurai, or is it just nothing whatsoever?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's fun. Okay, so the first thing we might note, going back to that seminal moment in 1868 when the shogun was overthrown.
Tokugawa.
Correct. Boy, this guy's good. They create an imperial.
Seriously, I loved studying under you. It's fantastic.
They create an imperial government in its stead, and again, this is the moment at which they embark on this determined pursuit of modernization. And again, that meant many things, many reforms, many things. One thing it meant was building a new army and a new navy, and doing it, modeling this new army and navy after the Western examples. In essence, and this is all samurai, guys who had been effectively mid-ranking samurai through the last shogunate. They then dominate this new imperial government, and they realize very, very quickly that the samurai, for all of his fine, upstanding principles, if they remained on that course, then Japan was gone. In other words, they needed a modern military, a modern navy, and again, they would have to pattern that after the Western examples. And so they did the smart thing. They said to themselves, where in the world is the best army? First up, they decided it was the French. Then there was the Franco-Prussian War, and they quickly went, oh, hell. And they kicked out all of their French military advisors, and they quickly switched over to the Prussians, or the Germans, of course. The Navy, Britain, of course, was second to none. So the Navy patterned itself very, very consciously after the British model. So what this meant, particularly in these early, say 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, early 1900s, there's a very, very, very conscious attempt at throwing out the samurai and just forgetting about him because he was pointless and useless in this new world that they were moving in.
Dave's like the samurai of this podcast.
I am. And
Right.
it kind of reminds me of that saying.
You're an anachronism. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's that saying that generals fight the last war, right? And I guess that, in that regard, that's probably where that samurai leadership is probably not embracing, the technology that is new war.
Can I ask I'll ask a bean counter question.
Mm.
So now,
How much it costs per soldier?
no, I'm thinking, but how did they fund this? Right, like back then. Now what we
That's
do
a
is
good question.
Now what do we do? We call up Treasury and go, can you print some more money for us? Can you sell us some more government bonds that someone's going to buy that are going to be junk bonds in about 20 years' time? But back then, politically, there must have been the will to invest. But then economically, did they just get themselves into a whole crap load of debt? What did they, or they had excessive reserves? How did they actually fund? Because the pace at which you're describing it would seem,
It's absurd.
That's right. So
Yeah.
and that obviously with time and velocity in terms of output, there's another variable called money.
And don't take that thoughtful question as the standard of what he normally comes up with on Monday night.
That's a really, really good question, and it's not the easiest question to answer. Partly because the Japanese islands are more or less bereft of natural resources. One thing they do have is, in some quantity, is silver. So,
Geez, wish I had that now, today.
it at least gave them some base. Paying for it, well, frankly, over time, empire was seen as a way of paying for a lot of this. So, on the one hand, you need empire in order to survive, and therefore you perhaps spend more than certainly what the fiscally minded, say your finance ministers or whatever may have thought. But I guess there was always this kind of well, on the one hand, it was like, well, if we don't do it, we're gone. And secondarily, well, if we do it and if we do it well, and if we, for example, there's this colonial experiment in Taiwan, then this means this gives us some hope of actually getting some returns on our investments, as it were.
And actually, that wasn't linear either, because there was assassination of the finance minister. Finance minister, yeah, or was
that
it
was a
foreign
precarious
minister?
position.
Yeah. Because they didn't want to fund some things.
Yes, being a minister could be a precarious role in
Yeah.
but,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe I'll
That's
just park
okay. No,
that
that's
answer
fine.
there.
No.
It's not a great
Oh,
answer, but
no, that's fine. So we've got this. So Japan are looking at increasing their sphere of influence, and this is what the early 30s into the late. Let's say early 30s, right?
Well, actually,
Now-
just before you go on, I reckon a brief overview of what happens at the League of Nations, because that's an accelerant to where Tony's going.
okay. So maybe again, I'll do it again. We'll go back a step to the immediate aftermath.
Mauritian
Why?
Queen, are you listening? So can I go back a step when you ask me questions and not answer questions? My lovely wife.
Okay. Well, yes, it's a good one. Use me as your
That's it.
as your scapegoat.
Yep.
I've got broad shoulders. I can wear it. In the aftermath of World War One, so the Japanese attend the Paris Peace Conference as one of the great powers. They're sitting at the table alongside the United States, the Brits, French, etc. One thing that happens ultimately it's the Americans and the British. The British primarily because of Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes. They reject a Japanese proposal for racial equality to be written into the League of Nations. Interestingly, if we kind of then fast forward to 1946, the Japanese emperor, sat down with 5 of his courtiers and talked his way across a series of kind of meetings like this in its own way. I think there were 5 of them in total, maybe 10 or 12 hours in total, and he talked his way through the origins and course of World War II. And he starts right there. He starts at these racial or racial discrimination that Japan faced at the hands of the Americans, and then he, depending on which version of this talk, often it's referred to as the monologue. Depending on which version of the monologue you take a look at, certainly one version, a slightly more polished, partial version, makes explicit reference to the White Australia policy as well, and that this was kind of containing the Japanese in a ways that rankled. I'm not I would point to slightly different developments, and I would note that through the I'll do it in broad brushstrokes. Through the 1920s, Japan operated so on the one hand you have the League of Nations, but do recall that the United States was not a League of Nations member. So at the same time that Japan's in the League, it's also participating in what was known as the Washington system, which was created at the Washington Conference in 1921. In essence, what happens there, the US, Britain, and Japan, other nations were involved, but ultimately these were the 3 key players. They agreed to, there were 2 agreements in particular that were key at the Washington Conference. One, they agreed to limit the size of their navies. So this is at a time when the battleship was, in essence, this was the nuclear weapon of the time, right? This was how the ultimate measurement of national strength. And they agreed to limit the number of battleships each of them had. And so by these naval agreements, what they ultimately did, they rendered war in the Pacific completely out of the question, because the Japanese, with the ratios that they agreed upon, the Japanese could not start war in the Pacific, not rationally, because they could not do it in the confidence that they would win that war. Nor could the United States start that war in the confidence that they would win, and nor could the Brits do so. So it essentially set this perfect equilibrium in the Pacific. And so that then, it removes war as a rational option, right? The second agreement they reached was to stay out of China's really, really messy domestic political scene. So essentially what they agreed to do was to pursue commercial competition in China, rather than to be backing some of the warlords and getting themselves in a situation where, for example, the Japanese might be backing one Chinese warlord. If the Americans back another one and those 2 warlords go to war against each other, then you've sort of got a proxy war playing out in the backwaters of China somewhere. And so they agreed, let's not do that. We'll just pursue commercial competition. And through the 1920s, this worked exceptionally well. It worked really, really well. This Washington system hummed along very, very, very nicely. And all 3 nations, basically, they're making some serious coin in China. Certainly for the Japanese, it meant that the naval budget went from like sky high, and suddenly it's down here somewhere. So again, this means that they've actually got some money that they can put into other things rather than into new battleships. And so everything's going along really, really, really well. Then the Great Depression hits. And the Great Depression, obviously, it's destroying national economies, but it destroys the global economy.
So I'm interested in understanding, as Japan are increasing their influence in the 30s and even into the mid-30s, and they've got this desire to have significantly more influence in their region, as they looked west into what's happening in Europe across that continent, what's their thinking? Are they kind of saying, yeah, well, that's a whole problem over there that we don't need to deal with? Or are they thinking at some point there needs to be some type of alliance? What was their thinking at that point?
So my first answer to this is to note that I've had this conversation with a friend of mine. He's a historian at University of Hong Kong. and a really, really very solid historian.
Just bring your mic
A bit closer.
That's it. That's it. The dulcet tones.
There we are.
You got
There
it.
we are. I should note before I go any further with this answer that I'm always hesitant when I pick up a book and I see someone saying, I don't know, for example, the Japanese government thought this, or because I always think who in the Japanese government?
Yeah.
First up, which institution, and then from there also because for example, say the Japanese army, if you peel back terribly far, you would realize that there were factions in there. There were and some very, very, very different mindsets. So I'm speaking in some pretty broad brushstrokes here, but if we speak about that attraction of an alliance with Germany, and that was particularly strong in the Japanese army, that's where this really grows from. And maybe if we just stick with the key points, by the time or once the German army had marched through Western Europe, Western continental Europe, the voices in Japan calling for an alliance with Germany became loud and insistent, and they're operating, on a couple of key assumptions. And maybe we can boil it down to two. So the first one is that because the French had surrendered, because the Dutch had surrendered, and because it seemed, at least to the Japanese, but frankly to many beyond Japan as well, because it seemed that the British were on the verge of surrender, they were hanging on by the skin of their teeth. This, for many in Japan, it seemed to open up this magnificent vista of opportunities in Southeast Asia, in colonial Southeast Asia, so French Indochina, all those places we talked about before, Dutch East Indies, all the British colonies were, so far as the European colonial masters were concerned, these colonies were now defenseless. They could not do anything to stop the Japanese from taking those colonies if the Japanese chose to do so. So that's the first point of real interest in a military alliance with Germany. The second one is that the two nations which could plausibly create problems for this move into Southeast Asia, and those two nations being the Soviet Union and the United States. And no coincidence that these are the two nations that either the Japanese army, in the case of the Soviets, or the Japanese Navy, in the case of the Americans, these are the two nations that are their number one hypothetical enemies, right? So it all kind of comes together in a really interesting and neat way, at least from, I don't know, someone like my perspective. That's a really, really interesting way that it came together. But in essence, the alliance with Germany was designed to deal with these two nations in slightly different ways. So first, the Soviets, the Germans had kind of swallowed their ideological revulsion for the communist experiment and had signed a neutrality pact with the Soviets, and the Japanese were no less repulsed by Bolshevism. Nonetheless, they were keen to follow in the German footsteps and to do the same, to sign a neutrality pact with the Soviets and get them on side. This essentially meant that the Japanese could be reasonably certain they could move down into Southeast Asia and they wouldn't have the Soviets coming at them from behind.
That was going to be my next question. At this point of signing this, I assume they've already made a decision. We're going into Southeast Asia, which is it the Nanshin plan? Is that what's the drive south? How's it?
Yeah, okay, so Nanshin. Yeah, so yes, the southward advance. The other nation that could plausibly that was a potential stumbling block in all this was the United States. The alliance with Germany, and I should note also fascist Italy. It included a key clause which effectively guaranteed that if the United States went to war against any of the three contracting parties, so if the US went to war in Europe against the Europeans and against the Germans and the Italians, then by the terms of this pact, the United States could be quite certain that the Japanese would hit them from behind. Equally, if the US went to war against Japan in Asia and the Pacific, they could be reasonably certain that Hitler and Mussolini would hit them from behind. And so what this, I won't speak to German or Italian ambitions, but so far as the Japanese were concerned, this was a clear threat of war. And the idea was that this would scare the United States away from war, so that it would basically give them freedom of movement down in Southeast Asia.
So just for my own knowledge then, so Japan, they want to keep the US at arm's length,
If possible.
security via strength, if you like. What I mean, they got these pacts. So US, you keep your, like, when is that? Is that up until the early 40s?
So they conclude the pact with Germany and Italy in September 1940.
So September 1940, they're basically saying, keep the US out and we're good. And we can kind of head south, start heading south. Now, how important were the resource constraints in Japan around oil, steel, and rubber? How much of that were around, like, kind of led them to say, you know what, we need to get a hold of some natural resources, because to your earlier point, they're resource poor.
Yes. You're pushing up against the great conundrum for Japanese decision makers in this period, because how should we do this? So the Japan at this point in time, let's say September 1940, was importing over 90% of its oil from the United States. So if you just think about that for a minute, the concern was, I don't know, here's another really dodgy analogy, but if I go out and if I buy a really shiny...
This podcast was built on dodgy
analogies? Okay, okay. I can go out and buy myself a shiny red Ferrari tonight, and I can drive it around. I can kind of feel good, look cool. Maybe, I'm not sure about that, but at least in my own mind, I'm looking good, right? And yet, if I don't put gas in the car, before very long, it's a white elephant. It's just sitting on the side of the road. It's not moving. By the same token, the Japanese fleet it's very big. It's very shiny. It moves really fast. But if you don't put gas in the tank, these ships become a whole bunch of white elephants. And so the Japanese Navy, whereas in the Army you have this idea that the alliance with Germany should scare the United States away from war, then the Navy officers are not so sure. They're saying, wait a minute. They're saying, no. If we hit the rubber hits the road at the idea of whether or not United States and Britain were separable. The Army argued that they were separable. Then, in other words, you could hit British colonies in Southeast Asia, and the Americans would stay away. The Navy was saying, if we hit the British colonies in Southeast Asia, the Americans are in. And
that was my next question. Was it? Yeah. Well, so keep going. Yeah. That's what I was going to say. Was it ever considered to say, just stay away from anything that the US owns, and this is what we'll do?
From the Navy's perspective, if you hit anything British, that also means the Americans are in as well. So ultimately...
Which is obviously what leads to Pearl Harbor, right? Because then it's the concept of knocking out the US fleet that can steam west and cut them off from the rubber, the oil, and the tin they need in Southeast Asia.
Yeah. So ultimately the oil, there's a sense that, okay, we can't maintain this situation where 90% of our oil is coming from Texas. That just can't work, right? Yeah. The only feasible alternative was the Dutch East Indies and Borneo, perhaps. So that's the prize, right? They've got to get down there. But the only way you can get there, I mean, it's like saying, maybe I won't throw another bad analogy. I mean, the bottom line was
be afraid of bad
analogies. They were never going to get to the Dutch East Indies unless they first took French Indochina. They first had to take, say, Malaya. I mean, you just weren't going to do this, right? And equally, by the time maybe let's just leave that there. So what we're finding ourselves in this strangely circular reasoning, because on the one hand, there's this thought that, okay, in order to better prepare for war with the United States, we got to get ourselves down into the Dutch East Indies, and we need to get those oil fields. Then the second thought that comes along is that if we go into the Dutch East Indies, or on our way to the Dutch East Indies, we're actually bringing on war with the United States. So we're getting ourselves into this strangely circular reasoning that's playing out particularly strongly within the Japanese Navy, and it it never really resolved that that conundrum.
What triggers the US to put the embargo on importation of oil, tin, rubber into Japan?
So,
And sorry, and then when did that happen? The embargo.
Right.
Just wanted- Thank you.
yep, okay. So it happens in two stages. So the Japanese, at almost exactly the same time that they signed the military alliance with Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, so back September 1940, the Japanese forces advance into the northern half of French Indochina. And at that moment, the Roosevelt administration over in Washington slaps an embargo on aviation-grade fuel, as well as scrap iron. And those things weren't enough to hit the Japanese where it really hurt, but it was enough to make them sit up and take
Let's
notice
send a
and say,
message.
we can,
Yeah.
Curiously, very many in Japanese policymaking circles didn't really listen very hard to that message. And so fast forward to July 1941, and the Japanese reached the decision to move into the southern half of Indochina, at which point the Americans said, that's it. And they did two things. So one, they placed a complete trade embargo on Japan, which meant no oil. The second thing the Americans did was to freeze all Japanese assets in the United States. The Brits followed suit, the Dutch followed suit. And so at that moment, now the Japanese find themselves in a really, really serious situation, because they have, now they have a finite amount of oil, and there's no way that they can change that situation unless they go into the Dutch East Indies, which means war with the United States. So they now find themselves in a very really high pressure situation, and the concern is if you become, in particular, again, so noting that now we're talking about war in the Pacific, so this is now very much a conversation that's playing out within the Japanese Navy, and the voices, the basic concern that's being voiced it goes something along these lines. It's, okay, so if we don't go to the Dutch East Indies and get this oil, we will, at some point in time, this finite oil supply that we have will run dry. Our ships will not move. We're sitting ducks, and they're going to come and get us. At that moment, they're just waiting for that, right? And so they'll come at that point, and they will blow us out of the water. And so the only possible way out of the situation then is to go into the Dutch East Indies, get that oil, and
And to clarify for people listening too, when you talk about your Ferrari without any gas, it would be bad enough if you're talking about an economy that slows and then you go and negotiate and you get, either things completely lift or what you want. But the Japanese are 2 years into a war in China as well. So they've actually got a war going on. Yeah.
Yes.
So
it's an enormous drain of
correct.
resources.
So this isn't just an embargo for your general everyday economy. This is already curtailing a war, a hard fought gains in mainland China.
Yeah.
So,
yes.
So can I ask then? So we're on the so the Japanese now are under pressure, right?
Mm-hmm.
Embargo, they can't get down because they're gonna, if they start heading south, the US gets sucked into it. They've got a finite amount of oil. At that stage, in terms of government, army, and then most importantly the Navy, right? What was their thinking in the lead up to Pearl Harbor? Like, were they backed into a corner where they thought to themselves, if we go south, we're gonna bring him in. There's only a certain amount of resources we got, and someone hatched the idea. Let's go after them when they're not expecting it. So I know that's a hard question to answer. I'm just intrigued by this stuff.
No, it's not hard to answer. It's because some of this stuff, this is why I love this stuff. It's because the question you asked is a 10-part series.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about it.
So maybe this is the best way to answer that question. So if we focus in on the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack plan, so this is Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, who...
Sounds so sexy when you...
I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but
Actually, can you do me a favor? Can you say Shohei Ohtani?
The baseball player, Ohtani Shohei.
Yeah, look at that. It sounds better when you say it.
Well, yeah. So Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack plan, so he first, I think we were talking about this really briefly the other day, right? So he first conceives of this Pearl Harbor and of the Pearl Harbor attack plan in, let's say, January 1941. His role was he was commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. So his role is not in any way or form. He has no input into decisions for war, decisions for peace, anything like that. His role is plain and simple, is to ensure that the fleet it's just humming and in a perfect state of nick. And if and when it comes to it, that it goes. That's his role.
Before you go on, because that's interesting, you've just taught me something there, because my understanding of not the overall planning, but as part of planning the attack, not the overall war planning, part of the planning the attack for Pearl Harbor, I always assumed that he had control over who he had in, say, in charge of the Kido Butai, right? So Nagano, Nagumo. Because again, it's my understanding that Yamamoto didn't have extreme confidence, but he was the senior guy, and that's why he led the Kido Butai, where to me, I've always thought, well, that's still a failing of Yamamoto not to have the balls to actually remove him from the position. But if he didn't have that power...
Well, so I think I'll address that question as quickly as I can. These guys are all trained in, the Navy officers are all trained in the Naval War College. And the training they receive is designed to ensure that how shall I put it? So if we go back to our football analogy, the training they received at the War College was such that it should not have mattered whether it was me drawing up the war plans, or again, to go back to the football analogy, if I were the coach, if you were the coach, or if you were the coach, it should not have mattered. We should have been, ultimately, we should have reached almost exactly the same conclusions, because everything was meant to be so perfectly, it was meant to be extremely scientific and extremely, I can't really think how best to explain it other than to say that each planner was meant to reach the same conclusion. So from Yamamoto's perspective, having Nagumo there or having some other officer, that probably doesn't really change. And frankly, he doesn't really have control over that personnel question anyway. But I do want to mention something that around the Pearl Harbor attack plan, because there's a scholar in Japan, see if I can think of his name, Todaka. I'm not sure I'm going to remember his given name off the top of my head. But anyways, he's written a terrific piece reasonably recently, in the last 5 years or so. Makes an incredible case, which I find really convincing. He makes the case that Yamamoto conceived of this plan, and maybe we need to start from the base setting. This plan is so ridiculously risky, it's not funny. And so he conceives of it in January 41. Not until October 41 did the Navy General Staff give him the okay to proceed with this Pearl Harbor attack plan. And it was only, even then, so the Navy Chief of Staff said, well, if it's, it came down to, so Yamamoto actually said, either it's the Pearl Harbor or I resign, I retire, and I'm walking. I'll go onto the reserve list. And they could not afford to lose him. He was so good that they couldn't afford to lose him. And so the Navy Chief of Staff, he's looking at it and he's thinking, this is crazy. And yet he's got to hang on to Yamamoto. So he says, okay, well, if he thinks he can do it, then we'll give it to him then. This most recent scholarship suggests, again, I find this really, really persuasive, that actually Yamamoto, he was actually playing a game, right? And what he was gaming it so bad. What he was trying to say was, he was expecting the Navy Chief of Staff to say no.
See you later.
But ultimately, his bluff was so damn good that they took him at his word and said, "All right, well, let's give it to him." So, in other words, he was actually trying to steer Japan in his own way. He was actually, and there's plenty of statements he makes through 1941 where he makes it very, very clear that we can't beat them. There's no way in hell that we haven't got a snowflake's chance in hell of beating them. He makes that statement, not quite in those words, but he makes that statement repeatedly through 1941. So that first up, there's good grounds to think that he knows full well, and he certainly his career from say 1930 onwards, he's part of a faction within the Japanese Navy that is dead against war with the United States, precisely because he's convinced that they can't win. So this idea that he conceives of the Pearl Harbor attack plan, not in order to knock the US out so bad that it somehow gives us a hope of victory, it's actually quite the opposite. He conceives of the plan. It's so audacious, it's so mad that he conceives of it in the hope that the Navy Chief of Staff is going to say no, and then at that point, all bets are off, and then somehow they find a way out of the situation that they find themselves in.
Because Yamamoto himself studied in the US.
Yeah. Yes.
Was it Harvard?
He was at Harvard as a language officer for a couple of years, yes.
And because it's my understanding that one of the strong reasons he had for not wanting to go to war with the US and believing they couldn't win was the statement of, awaking the sleeping giant, that he'd seen their industrial capacity and what they could ramp up to, and he just felt that was so strong that you couldn't beat someone that had sort of industrial might. It's interesting you mentioned that, because obviously when I studied under you was longer than 5 years ago. But based on that, what's been written, that would make sense, because I remember you talking about the failings of the Pearl Harbor planning, and specifically the two things of not hitting the fuel dump, not hitting the dry docks, which meant that obviously they didn't wipe out the fuel supply, and the ships that were repairable were repaired very quickly and back in service, leaving aside the aircraft carriers being out of harbour. But if that's the case, that he was coming up with an absurd plan, you wouldn't be worried about dotting every I and crossing every T, because you're putting together an absurd plan on the thesis that it's going to
get knocked back.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that though, because I also think when all is said and done,
if he's so brilliant, how would you overlook those things? The other thing
it's possible to. I think it's possible, because I think it's really, really important to keep in mind that, like I was saying before, even as late as certainly within the Japanese, and now Yamamoto, he was a little different. He was cut of different cloth to many of those other officers, and in fact, he was a real advocate of air power. Nonetheless, I think it really is important to keep in mind that even so, the battleship in 1941 remains that key symbol of national strength. So the idea that you would focus on the battleships and leave behind
the aircraft carriers, being out at sea, not
sea. I mean,
it's not front of mind. You wouldn't do it today.
No.
It'd be,
no. I mean, it became very clear very quickly in the course of war in the Pacific that air power. This was the
new superiority.
Yes.
Now we're at Pearl Harbor. This gets to the crux of some of my frustration of my fellow Australians, because obviously if you say Pearl Harbor to even young ones, wasn't that Japan attack? They get it. But what went on as part of that drive south was there was attacks on Pearl Harbor at the same time. There was Hong Kong, there was Singapore, Malaya, in Australia not long after. And a lot of people forget that coordinated attacks, or those within the next 7 days, 14 days, which gets very much to, I don't want to jump around too much, but we're obviously trying to get a very solid base here before we go. But from the Australian perspective, the Japanese attack on Singapore, because later on I'd love to have you on and have a whole conversation around the fall of Singapore and how that's sort of the final nail in the coffin of Australia, Great Britain reliance. But how much of the planning for Pearl Harbor at the time was done in conjunction with all those things? So, for example, would Yamamoto have sat down with other planners, and they've said, okay, you're in charge of Hong Kong, and you're in charge of Malaya, and you're in charge of the Philippines, and okay, so what resources are being allocated to who, where, why, how?
No, he didn't sit. So Malaya is essentially, that's an army operation, and the two services, they didn't talk so much. So they're not sitting across a table like this, and that's happening at a different level.
So this is sort of Tojo at that point. Actually, Tojo's not in charge at this point, is he? He's not the.
Here's a terrific example. Terrific example of the complexities of the Japanese decision-making process. So I'll do this as succinctly as possible because it's kind of tricky, but it's really important, and I can tie it to a kind of a good story, which I think will work. So the Constitution makes clear that the emperor takes advice from his cabinet ministers. That's one article in the Constitution. A separate article in the same Constitution also notes that the emperor has supreme command of the army and navy. And so what this creates within Japanese governing structures, on the one hand, you have the cabinet, so obviously your prime minister and foreign minister, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, you have the armed services. And a very, very popular or kind of a catchphrase of the time was the independence of the supreme command. In other words, if, for example, the prime minister turned to the army chief of staff or the navy chief of staff and said, "You should do this," he would never say that, because there is no way that they would regard his word as in any way final. And so what this meant was that on the one hand, you have all of this operational planning taking place over in the supreme command, in the general staffs. Over here, you have the cabinet, and it's debating questions, among other things, questions of war and peace. You do have an army minister and a navy minister, both of whom are on active service in either the army or the navy. They have to be kind of general rank or admiral rank. And they're kind of like a pipeline between the cabinet and the armed services. But, okay, so in terms of so where Tojo fits, so he becomes prime minister in October 1941, so roughly 2 months before Pearl Harbor. He does not learn of the Pearl Harbor attack plan until, I hope I get my dates right here, I think it's 1st of December, maybe it's the 2nd of December.
Wow, that's huge.
And then hear this. He only learns of the Pearl Harbor attack plan in his role, because he retained his role as army minister, so he was both prime minister and army minister. He was also home minister, but we'll leave that one aside. He was prime minister and army minister, and so as army minister, he had a seat at the table of Imperial General Headquarters, where the general staffs, where they met with the emperor and discussed their war plans and so on. And so it's as army minister, he's invited not he's not an active participant in Imperial General Headquarters. He's a silent observer, and so he goes in on either the 1st or the 2nd of December. And it's at that moment, so the Navy Chief of Staff then explains the Pearl Harbor attack plan, and he's sitting there going, right. But here's the thing. He hears that as army minister, right? He doesn't learn that as prime minister. And so Tojo, he's a really interesting individual. So he divided his time between his different roles. So in other words, he would quite literally sit in the prime minister's office, let's say, on a Monday morning. Then at lunchtime, he would jump in the car and they would drive him over to the Army Ministry building, and he would then sit in the Army Minister's office for the afternoon, and he would knock over Army Minister business. And so he's in essence, he's wearing different hats depending on what particular thing he's taking care of at that time. Now, he hasn't learned of the Pearl Harbor attack plan as Prime Minister. He's learned of it as Army Minister. So it sounds absurd. It sounds completely bonkers. And yet, Army Minister Tojo will not inform Prime Minister Tojo of the Pearl Harbor attack plan. And that has, I won't go into it because it gets a bit, it's a little bit, there's some there's some details in there that I could tease out, and I could make a really, really interesting point, but it will take like hours to get there. So maybe that's one for another time.
Well, just to clarify that too for people listening, where you're saying 1 December, which it's 8 December, the attack on Pearl Harbor in Japan, 7 December in US time.
Yep.
But that 7 days, that matters, right? Because it's not as though you say you learn of the attack the next day, the Kido Butai, which is the mobile force, they're across there in a few hours. That means basically he's learning a day or two before they're starting to move into position.
Correct.
That's absolutely insane.
Which goes
imagine a US president, a British or Australian prime minister learning the day before.
Keep in mind that a US president is the commander-in-chief. The prime minister of Japan, remember, the emperor has supreme command of the army and navy. What the prime minister says, these guys don't have the army chief of staff, the navy chief. They don't have to if they choose not to listen to his advice. And here's a perfect example of what I'm talking about, right? So I'll try and knock this over as quickly as possible. In September 41, the Japanese, so the cabinet and the supreme command, they have a thing called a liaison conference where the cabinet plus the chiefs of staff they sit through these meetings together, and they're trying to bring the operational viewpoint and the policy viewpoint together and to get a coherent decision. In September 41, one of these liaison conferences, and it's extensively discussed across weeks and weeks and weeks. They do decide on it in September, and they ultimately take it to the emperor for his signature. They decide to place essentially a deadline for war with the United States. In other words, basically what they said was, if there's no diplomatic success, and we won't kind of get locked up in what diplomatic success might have looked like, but if there's no diplomatic success by before the last 10 days of October, we're going to war with the United States. It's game on. Subsequent to that decision, the prime minister, he was a civilian, he started having misgivings about this deadline for war. And so he's going back to his cabinet and saying, hell, what have we done? Look what's going to happen. We're going to lose this war. We're going to get bashed. And so he's trying to back out of the war. Tojo becomes so the prime minister at the time, his name is Konoye, and it becomes a Konoye versus Tojo show. And the two of them are squaring off against each other. So you've got, on the one hand, this civilian prime minister saying, we can't do this. This is crazy. What are we doing? And Tojo is saying, even if I accepted your counsel, and he didn't, he refused to accept Konoye's counsel, because what his response to that, it took a couple of different, there were a couple of points which Tojo raised. One was, you're not a naval officer. How the hell can you comment on the prospects of victory or defeat in war with the United States? You've got you have no training, you have no understanding, you've got nothing. Your opinion means nothing to me. That was his first point. His second point was, even if I accepted your opinion and I agreed that we should not go to war with the United States, even though we've made a decision in the presence of the emperor that he's agreed to this is now sacrosanct in Tojo's view, right? He's saying the emperor has agreed to this. We can't turn back on it now. However, even if I were to accept your word and say, maybe we need to rethink this, there's nothing. The Constitution said it sets the Army Chief of Staff and the Navy Chief of Staff separate from the cabinet. So even with you as Prime Minister saying that we shouldn't do this, there's no reason for these guys to accept what you're saying. So what we're doing is you're actually inviting a situation where who knows what comes next.
A constitutional crisis.
Well, yeah, things were going to blow. Basically it meant a coup d'etat. The army was going to explode. And so
now on that, he ends up stepping down.
Konoye.
And Konoye's recommendation to the emperor is the prince to become, which is rejected because they didn't want
an imperial family member as prime minister, because that would in turn implicate the emperor himself.
Correct. So does that suggest that they had serious misgivings as well? Because if you go and win, you're not worried about that.
Well, yeah, of course. It meant, everyone was well aware that this was a gamble. This was a serious gamble. This was a really, really big gamble. But they also told themselves, well, the war against Russia, that was a big gamble too, and yet we pulled that off. So,
Well, they hadn't lost a war in thousands of years.
Torjor hung his head on that one. But that, yeah.
But
it doesn't always.
To me, it just means you're getting closer. But let's now go forward to the Pearl Harbor attack. Tora.
Mm-hmm.
What's the Japanese view of the attack once it's finished? Do they see it as a success?
Sure. I mean, it was. It meant that for a period at least, the American fleet was not. They didn't have to worry about the American fleet for a period of time. How long that might be was up for debate, but at least for a period, it meant no American fleet to have to contend with. So, yeah, that's a success for sure.
And in terms of, as I was mentioning earlier, about the same time, there's a whole bunch of Hong Kong, Philippines, and the like. One area that really interests me is obviously Singapore because of even today, the impacts we feel in terms of our national security and foreign policy. It also intrigues me the amount, like the way in which the Japanese took the Malayan Peninsula on push bike and the amount of soldiers they did it with as opposed to the Allied forces on Singapore. So that was led by Yamashita, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I know we're getting a little bit off your subject matter expertise. How good was Yamashita? Like tactically, was that something? Did he get lucky, or was the Tiger of Malaya really the Tiger of Malaya?
Yeah, he was. I mean, so these guys. If we just rewind the clock and go back to his, say Yamashita or any of these, any general rank officer, to be a general in the Japanese army, you must necessarily have gone to the War College and received 4 years of training at the War College. And there, I mean, these guys, it's very, very Japanese in a sense. The way that they were going about this, because it was essentially they were looking at battles past, often enough. For example, say the Russo-Japanese War, and they would look at a particular battle from that war. And the student would be given a kind of a case study from that battle, and he'd be told, right, well, you have essentially the forces that were sent into this battle. The Russians have this. Your job is now to play out this battle and to ensure that you win this battle. And they do this just over and over and over for 4 years. This is all they do. They spend their whole time determining, in the minutest possible detail, determining how you move troops, how you do everything within your power to win a battle. The ultimate aim of this is to ensure that, again, that these generals that actually they're operating from the same basic principles, the same ideas, so that actually at least theoretically, it shouldn't matter enormously whether it's General A or General B in any particular operation, because they should have. I mean, of course, it doesn't necessarily play out that way because for a whole variety of reasons. But the level of training these guys had, it's astonishing what they were, and the training that they received. It's I don't know. It's very, very Japanese. I mean, these are people who, I don't know. They like everything to be. I don't know. You create my family goes on a family holiday somewhere. My dear Japanese wife will create a schedule that's almost down to the last minute. Everything is. This is the way.
Well, I actually caught the wrong train in Japan, the bullet train, because I heard a train coming in. I was going up the stairs. I was carrying bags, and I looked at my clock, and I'm like, "Oh, it's 1:19. Oh crap!" Because I was catching a train at 1:20. So I race up. I get up there, and the last 15 seconds it takes, I jump on the train, right? Sydney trains, 1:19, 1:20. That's the 1:20. I was on the wrong train. Right. Yeah. Because they're so efficient that no, the next one was 30 seconds later I was on. So it's unbelievable, the efficiency. But the other thing I find, and we'll do a whole episode on this, but for me, the fall of Singapore is like the end of the British Empire to me.
Certainly in this part of the world, yeah.
Yeah, and well, for me, I think there's, like, obviously, First World War cost them a lot of money. Second World War sort of finishes them off and bankrupts them. There's a whole bunch of other battles and different things you could go into. But to me, the reason why I say the fall of Singapore is that it was considered there was no way it was ever going to fall. The Japanese were outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1. When the British start evacuating the civilians, they're leaving their servants and stuff, the local Malay there, that starts to show them that where push comes to shove, you're not anything. Mm-hmm. When the Japanese, and this is something in your sphere, when the Japanese take it, they do something I found very interesting, and that's get the 50,000 Indian colonial troops and talk to them about, do you want to keep fighting your colonial masters, or do you want to join what will be the new first ever Indian National Army, which was led by, was it Bose Singh, who had also been in Germany, and he was a hardcore nationalist. And the 20,000 Indian troops that end up joining and get sent to Burma to shore up the defenses against India. And for me, it's it sends this message that you can throw off the shackles of the colonial master, because the Malays no longer have trust in the Brits in Singapore. The Indians are fighting for independence. And then there's a whole bunch of movements that echo through for the next 10, 20, 30 years of independence movements that believe, the great British Empire is no more.
And yet here we are with the Union Jack still on our flag, Dave.
We'll do that one a whole nother episode. I have no issue. I think it's time for us to come up with a flag that's unifying. But I have an issue with changing Australia Day, but we'll go into that in another episode. But I have no issue with us becoming a republic. I have no issue with a new flag. I think we need a Bill of Rights, but that's getting more than a weave.
I just want to because I think time's going to beat us, but we're going to get the doc back on, aren't we?
Hopefully,
yeah, it'll be great.
Because this is, Tone, what I'm really doing here is I'm getting you a postgrad education for free.
Right at the start, you said something really interesting, Peter. You said, I hate the word inevitability, right? So just talk us through that in the context of, let's just pick something very topical.
Well, that's tied into exactly what's going on at the moment, right?
That's what I mean.
So the Don Road Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere, China in the Pacific. So, at this point, and obviously we've really only, I know it's been a great episode, but we've really touched on stuff. So for our listeners, we'll go in depth to a whole bunch more in the future. But topically, what are you seeing of the 1930s imperial Japan and China and the US, for that matter, its interest in the South Pacific? And
so a couple of thoughts, maybe not terribly coherent.
That's our whole podcast, so welcome. So it only took us an hour and a half, and we've already made him dumber.
We should add that hashtag onto our hashtag terribly incoherent.
It reminds me of Billy Madison.
Yeah.
Everyone is dumber for having listened to that, and I award you no points. See what we've done? We take great minds, we turn them into mush.
Well, let's see. So in terms of the word inevitable, I don't know, we hear it. I'm not sure how much we hear it, but I think there are certainly voices out there that will tell us, for example, that war between the United States and China is inevitable. I think that reveals, or anyone who makes that claim, I would suggest, is enormously lazy in their intellectually lazy, because.
So is that a critique of power transition theory? Which for the layman, that means as nation states rise and fall in the global hierarchy, conflict is inevitable.
I'm not, as a historian, I'm not a huge fan of theory, full stop. I think political science and IR, it has its limits because I tend to think that these theories, they you can only push them so far. Maybe I'll just leave that one there. I'm not a huge fan of theory.
The one that's always frustrated me is it Fukuoka, The End of History? I thought, wow.
Fukuyama.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's like no, there's no such thing as end of history.
That's a little bit of American triumphalism, frankly. Him being a Japanese American, but So this idea that, say, war between China and the United States is inevitable, I would, there are any number of possible alternative outcomes or things that would lead to a very different outcome that we can point to. And I'll point to one or two. So first up, Chinese demographics are, this is kind of an own goal in a sense. I mean, the one-child policy.
Yeah.
Obviously they've lifted it, and yet, the bottom line is China's demographics are following a broadly similar pattern to what we see currently playing out in Japan. That's and right. Also in South Korea. In other words, just not enough babies being born. And we're seeing it down here in Australia too. Migration, I think.
Masks a lot.
It does. Nonetheless, back to the point at hand here. Japan faces, it's facing demographic Armageddon. It's in a very, very difficult situation, and I don't know that. I'm not really sure how it climbs its way out of that hole that it's currently in. South Korea in a similar situation. The Chinese are going along a vaguely, or they're moving in similar ways. Now, the Japanese economy has fallen flat for the last couple of decades, not solely because it would be ridiculous to suggest that it was because of the demographics that the economy has tanked. Nonetheless, that plays into it. And so I guess my point being, this idea that the rise of China is inevitable, the demographics for mine immediately suggest otherwise, that this continued rise of China, I'm not convinced. Another point I would make on this idea of, say, the rise of China being inevitable, and that the rise of China will inevitably mean war with the United States, I would simply point out that, of course, what the Chinese economy has done over the last, say, 2, maybe 3 decades, it's astonishing what has happened, and yet there remains extreme poverty. Move out of Shanghai and get out into the provinces. In other words, the gaps that are playing out in Chinese society, and the idea, I'm not sure that China we certainly shouldn't be viewing it as this monolithic state that where everyone's marching to the same beat, because I'm not convinced they are. So there's two things that I would point to. So again, demographics, and then just inequality or the inequities within China itself. Those two things put together, to my way of thinking, suggest that it certainly doesn't mean that China will not continue rising. It may well do so. I think they raise significant questions around the inevitability of that continued rise, and that in turn raises questions around the inevitability of some kind of Chinese-US war. In terms of a couple of other quick parallels, one, I am a little concerned at the Trump administration's approach to foreign affairs. It seems to me, it's anyone's best guess, but my sense is that they, at least some in the administration, are seeing the world in terms of spheres of influence. So that they see that there's a Russian sphere and a Chinese sphere and an American sphere. I find that a little disturbing, to be honest, because what that does, actually, that's straight out of, if you look at, so there's a Japanese foreign minister, he was foreign minister between, July 1940 and then July 41, so essentially for 12 months, and he was really, really interesting guy, educated in the United States, perfectly fluent English, raw verbosity. He would just unleash this torrent of words, whether it was in English or Japanese. He was perfectly capable in English as well. But he, to go back to that discussion on the Tripartite Pact, he was painting a portrait of a world in which, so Greater East Asia would be the Japanese sphere. The Americans could have their sphere over on the continent. The Germans and the Italians, they would be over in Europe and Africa. I mean, what you're talking about are armed camps that are lining up against each other, which...
But that's also the history of the world, right? That it's the long peace we've had post 1945. There's been wars, but between great powers, that's the anomaly in history.
Yes and no. Yes and no. I think I just can't help but think that. Well, maybe let me put it a slightly different way. So, the United States, in its position in Asia and the Pacific, acts as it acts as a steadying influence on what any nation in Asia and the Pacific might or might not do. Because essentially, if you decide you're going to do something, you necessarily have to factor in how the United States might respond. Were the United States to pull out of this region, things change very, very, very dramatically. We're in a much more dangerous world.
Tony and I have had this conversation, and this will be one of the episodes we want to get to, particularly when we discuss how we got to ANZUS and the validity of ANZUS today and tied in with AUKUS. But this is something we talk about all the time, that the last thing Australia needs, and this has been purely self-centered Australian, is either an isolationist US or a very limited US that it sees no value in this part of the world to its strategic interests. For me, one of the things I think, my view of what's going on in the US, just on the foreign affairs stuff, there's plenty of others, is what they're facing is the reality of what empire costs, and they're starting to reevaluate what is in their direct strategic interest and what part can we accept that, when the collapse of the Soviet Union and we were the single superpower, our strategic influence is that whole round thing. Now they're starting to say, this is what we can afford. Here's where we get these resources. Here's what we can control. And we're going to have to accept there are other great power players back on the chessboard.
Yes. So definitions of national interest, how you reach, of course that should remain in play. Nothing should be baked on forever, of course. I totally agree with that. And I think, well, anything other than that would be, that would also be intellectually lazy, not to be considering what is in this case, American national interest, or frankly, for the Australia, of course, Canberra should be doing exactly the same thing, right? What's in our national interest? What do we need? What do we not? So on and so forth. I think here I'm mindful of, there's a wonderful American scholar, his name's, since not that long ago, passed away maybe as many as 10 years ago. His name's Norman Graebner. And in fact, co-authored a few books with Joe Siracusa we were talking about before. But Graebner, there's one book which he put together. It's a whole bunch of readings and resources, none of which he wrote himself. They're all primary sources and so on. But essentially, what he's doing is, the title of this book is Ideas and Diplomacy, and he points out in this book that U.S. foreign policy is, on the one hand, as it must necessarily be, it's calculations of power and understanding the limits, in particular, understanding the limits of American power and what it can and what it cannot do. But he also notes that there's also the ideas, and the idea of, for example, you were saying before that you think Australia should have a Bill of Rights. America is far from perfect, and we can point to any number of indiscretions and various other things that it's done down the years, and yet it, to tie it back to this idea of the world today, the US in this region means that we maintain that we can have conversations like this one without fear of repercussions. And whilst
100%.
the United States isn't, it would be a mistake to attribute that solely to the United States, because of course, I mean, we're in Australia. Nonetheless, the US presence has allowed Australia to remain, or for conversations to be, well, again, this one, I mean, we can say what we want, right? I don't think we face any particular repercussions.
And there you're on the crux of why I invited you on and why I want to do a whole series with you, because I can't get through to enough people. I have zero issue with criticism of anything, right? Including myself, except for you, Mauritian Queen. You're not allowed to criticize me, honey. I'm perfect. But in all seriousness, there's plenty you can criticize in the US, but people don't understand the US taxpayer funds that Navy. That Navy keeps the shipping lanes open. They champion free speech. They champion innovation. Like if you write down a ledger of pros and cons, the pros are going to be so much longer than the cons. And that doesn't mean that I want people to shut up and not criticize, because criticism is an important part of getting things better personally, professionally, nation states. But at some point, we need the generations that are carrying on at the moment as if Western civilization's the worst thing ever. Give me the country you want to move to. Tell me what's better. And tell me, do you really want to live under a Chinese superpower as the only superpower of the world? Because it wouldn't be what we have today.
Yeah, well, I would argue on that one. I would simply note, again, the United States is guilty of all manner of ills in its time, but maybe the simple way of putting it is, better the devil you know. We maintain, we don't know what the region would look like in the absence of China, in the absence of the US. I think it's pretty clear that it would be a much more brutal a much more brutal corner of the world, and we're in it. So we very much want them to remain here as long as.
Well, part of Tony and I have discussed in a whole bunch of other topics, but one of the things that with critical minerals, rare earths, data centers, energy, Australia is basically the Saudi Arabia of everything bar oil. And I think if we had good energy policy and critical minerals and rare earths that we can start to mine, and part of that deal would be, hey, we want a battle group in the north or in the northwest, or at least something that comes around regularly enough that we can provide the port facilities, we can have some sort of trade deal to maximize the resources, but what we get, because our economy is not big enough for us to have, either our own nuclear program or to be running nuclear carrier, even one nuclear carrier group. And I think at some point we need to revisit what's our alliance look like, how important is it, and what are we going to do to try and get the best out of it, particularly in a time where it's quite fraught.
I think they're those submarines that are going to be here in 60 years' time.
Yeah, you and I go, you know what? I think I heard that because we'll be on the pension by then, I think for $2.50 we can ride those submarines all day, wherever we want around the Pacific.
Can we get a commitment for you to return at some stage, Peter?
Sure.
Because I want to expand on, so we got to Pearl Harbor effectively.
We got to Pearl Harbor.
Then
we're only scratching the surface.
That's right. Subsequent to that, obviously the actual physical attack on Japan from the US, and then into Europe, and then how it all kind of played out.
I've got one quick question. This is from the Mauritian Queen, because she asked me this question the other night, and I thought I said, I'll check with Dr. Mauch. I said, because I think this is the answer. The first attack from the US onto mainland Japan was the Doolittle raid, correct? I was right.
Mm-hmm.
So the Doolittle raid, what it was is they took bombers and they sort of modified them so they could take off from an aircraft carrier, but they didn't have enough fuel to get back. And Captain Doolittle led the raid, and they bombed Tokyo. And that was sort of within a month or so of the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
April 42. So 4 or
5 months. And that was to sort of say, hey, we can hit you too. It was just the first little warning shot. But I have issues with that, and we'll take it up in a whole other episode. And the reason I have issues is the Japanese hit a military target and the US hit a civilian target.
Yeah. Yes. aerial bombardment. Yeah, maybe this is a good point to finish on. But yeah, I mean, aerial bombardment, as it played out in World War II, it raises very, very, very serious questions around just war type questions. So is it just to for 1600 years, it's been considered in these just war traditions, the civilians are off limits. So to be targeting them, and the bottom line is, I mean, so Japanese civilians became targets. It certainly raises questions over whether or not U.S. conduct in that war was just, and you can still make the case that it was. I'm not sure I'm not sure.
Well, we'll do a whole episode on it because I think the Manhattan Project and the use of the atomic bomb, because again, I grew up thinking they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, they followed it with Nagasaki because it was to end the war, save millions of lives in invading mainland China. And a smart guy taught me that actually no, at the Yalta Conference, there was an agreement that if the war in the Pacific didn't end within 3 months of the war in Europe, that the Russians would enter the war. And they did that by going into Manchuria, and that the dropping of those bombs was as much a message to them to say, go no further and we don't have to share the spoils of war.
So this is a topic of hot scholarly debate.
Perfect for this.
I would to summarize it in a nutshell. So, maybe I'll summarize my own position in a nutshell. So the US dropped the A-bombs at the end of World War II on Japan, and President Truman did so primarily. His number one intention was to hasten Japanese surrender. In other words, he regarded the A-bomb as a military weapon to bring about a military outcome, namely Japanese surrender. A nice bonus effect of the A-bombs was the show of strength toward the Soviet Union. And they've been having, the US and the Soviets had been butting heads over in Europe since the Germans had surrendered. They were butting heads on everything over there. And so this was a really nice bonus effect. And in that sense, you could argue that the A-bomb was it was a political weapon. But first and foremost, at least in my reading of the situation, other historians would disagree really strongly with me and say, no, that I've actually got it the wrong way around. But I would argue that it was first and foremost a military weapon. And on those, to tie that back to the questions around just war, you can, in fact, and a very, very good friend of mine, he's recently retired, professor of history at University of Notre Dame over in the US. He wrote a terrific book published by Cambridge, so nothing to sneeze at. He, in fact, made the case that the A-bombs were, in fact, justified. I wouldn't want to sit and debate him in a room. He has his mind is incredibly sharp, and I think it would be he'd be a formidable man to debate. But I am not sure if I agree with him on that one.
See, so we came on the podcast because he knew we're idiots, Tone.
That's right.
He wasn't worried about being in the room with Dumb and Dumber.
Exactly.
That's on that. Well, before we finish up, give a quick plug to your book, your new book.
Right.
Where people can find it.
Okay. So, new book coming out in the United States, March 3rd. I think rest of the world, I think it will be, I'm not 100% sure, at the very most 2 weeks thereafter. So that would be March 17. The main title of the book is Tojo, so Tojo. It's a military biography of Japan's prime minister through most of World War II. He was an army general on active service at the same time that he was prime minister. So ultimately hanged as a war criminal by the American and their allies, including us. So in that law court, it was actually an Australian jurist who presided over the tribunal that found him guilty and sentenced him to death. anyways, interesting guy, really, really interesting person. So if anyone's interested, yeah.
Well, I don't love the man, but I love the nickname. He was known as the Razor.
Yeah, he was. That was one of his nicknames. He had a bunch. So one was Razor because he had I'm just trying to think what one of his subordinates explained that he didn't. I won't get the wording quite right here, but it's pretty close to what one of his subordinates said, that he didn't really worry very much about what other people thought, and wasn't too worried about other people's feelings, and therefore he got things done. And that was, in that context, that was the idea of this nickname Razor, was that he just cut to the chase and got things done, which that sums him up pretty well.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. I don't just talk the talk, I walk the walk. The book is on pre-order. So I'm waiting for mine. Tone, is there any last questions?
No, just looking forward to getting Peter back again. It was really educational for me. So thanks for your time. Really appreciate it.
No, really happy to.
Yeah, no, I genuinely, I was stoked when you said you'd come on. I'd been mentioning it to Tony. Your name comes up sporadically through different episodes that, this will happen. Oh, we should have him on that. Oh, this will happen. So it's great to have you on. I think the world in which we live, particularly in this part of the world, I think there's going to be a lot for you to not only educate us and our listeners on, but I think, you could become the R2BW political foreign affairs expert in the Pacific. So, hopefully we don't end up discussing war in the Pacific. But anyway, thanks very much for your time. And as we always say on this podcast, Tone,
you're right to be wrong.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, gents.
Thank you for listening to this episode, and we hope you enjoyed it. Like us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. Please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.